professor of ethics and political philosophy here at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, which we call NTNU. The meeting tonight seeks to highlight the question whether, and if so, under which conditions, it is morally defensible to use gene editing on animals. The meeting is based in a project called CRISPRsalmon, which discusses the moral and social conditions for using this technology on farm salmon. I had this project together with Ingeborg Myhr, there, from Norse Climate and Environment, which was formerly known as Gjerris. We collaborate with the Biotechnology Advisory Board on the arrangement of 3 public meetings on relevant topics for the research project. And this is one of these meetings. Although our project concerns Norwegian salmon farming, in this meeting we wish to extend the scope to the overarching questions relating to the ethics of this technology applied to animals. But first, a few words on the project. Now, fish farming is the most important Norwegian bioeconomy industry, but as you all know, it is also controversial for ethical and environmental reasons. The basis for this food production is the salmon, an iconic animal in Norwegian culture. One promising approach to solving some of aquaculture's production challenges and to ensure higher value creation in aquaculture is using genome editing techniques, such as the CRISPR system. I won't explain this to you. I hope perhaps some of those biotechnologists attending the panel debate might enlighten you if you have any questions on it. But this emerging technology enables rapid and, they say, precise changes to the genetic basis of relevant salmon traits, and may well be called a disruptive technology because it has potential for really changing production. Our project aims to determine the acceptability of genome-edited salmon through an empirical ethics approach, combining descriptive and normative studies. To do that, we study public views on the moral value of salmon and the demands for a sustainable aquaculture industry, both in document studies and by focus group and interview studies of public and stakeholder views. These empirical studies, combined with academic texts on sustainability, animal and virtue ethics, will provide an analysis of moral conditions for use of genome editing in aquaculture. And to help us with that, we have engaged an international Animal Ethics Advisory Board, whom you will meet today. They will provide normative perspectives on the issues relevant for genome editing of animals. And then we will have a panel discussion with some leading Norwegian biotechnology researchers with extensive knowledge also concerning the challenging ethical issues involved. In this latter discussion, we hope that we can have questions and comments from the audience as well. So in the last part of the meeting, you are welcome to participate in the discussion. Now, those who will lead us through this meeting are Hanna Winther, who is PhD candidate on the CRISPRsalmon project, and Håvard Ørisland Eggestøl, Senior Advisor of the Biotechnology Advisory Board. And I leave the word to Hanna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So our first speaker today is Professor Mikki Gjerris. He's an associate professor of bioethics at the University of Copenhagen and holds a PhD in theologian bioethics. His research interests include climate change ethics, animal ethics, ethics of nature, bioethics, and medical ethics. And he has also been a member of the Danish Council of Ethics. So please welcome Mikki Gjerris. Give him a warm applause.
Thank you. Just looking at the screen, and it's Bernice's talk. I can try to give that, obviously, but might be a bit confusing.
them her?
Yes, the top one.
Yeah, okay.
Ah,
yeah.
That looks right, yes.
Yeah.
Ah, great. Good. And thank you for being here, I guess. And thank you for inviting me. Very excited to be in Norway talking about bioethics. Have worked together with some of the people from NTNU. Is that the correct pronoun? Good. Before. And I have been given the task to sort of set the scene around the issue of animal welfare, which I think is a very popular term. So I would like to begin tonight by making a short survey based on sound scientific methodology. How many of you think we should have less animal welfare? Just raise your hand. And I should say this is a safe space, so don't know. And that's typically what I meet when I talk to people, when I give talks, when I teach at university, that people really like animal welfare, and it's hard. Okay, but it's hard to imagine that, and somebody is coming, to imagine that someone would go, for instance, in a demonstration through the streets of Trondheim asking for less animal welfare. But the problem is when we all agree on something, animal welfare, sustainability, a nice meal, love, that we have very different perceptions of what it actually is. So that's what I'm going to try to say something about today. And I have very little time, so I have divided this into trying to answer 3 questions I ask myself. Why animal welfare? What is animal welfare? And how should we get animal? You always get sort of worried when they walk away with the cables, right? So, but and how could we get animal welfare? But let's begin with the why. And now the screen would be very nice, but okay, I'll try. I would like to begin with a quote from someone who holds a dear place in Norwegian hearts, at least people in Norway who work within the health sector. The Danish theologian K.E. Løgstrup, who back in 1956 wrote a book called Den etiske fordring. And in that book, and this is where the screen would be nice because I have to quote in Danish, but I'll read it slow. He says, Den enkelte har aldrig med et andet menneske at gøre, uden at han holder noget af dets liv i sin hånd. Vi er hinandens verden og hinandens skæbne. Med vor blotte holdning til hinanden er vi med til at give hinandens verden den skikkelse. Det fænomen, der her er tale om, er højst foruroligende. So what he's saying, briefly in English, is that we are always involved with each other in such a way that there is a power relation. Whenever I'm interacting with another human being, be it very close or very far, I have some of that person's life in my hand. And I decide what to do with that power. And for Løgstrup, this is just a neutral fact. This is how our existence is before we arrive at it, that we are sort of interdependent. But for Løgstrup, it also raises this etiske fordring, the ethical demand, that I should use this power to the benefit of the other. And that is very disturbing because we are involved with an enormous amount of people. Some of them are very close to us, some of them are very far away, but we are nonetheless involved with them, and we always have to think about how we use our power. So we are basically living a life of endless responsibility. Now, Løgstrup wrote this in 1956, and he had no thoughts for animals at that time. It was a very human-centered ethics. Later in his works, he sort of begins to think about nature, but never animals. But together with Jes Harfeldt, a philosopher working at Aalborg University in Denmark, I have been trying to... That's okay. It's not distracting at all. I have been trying to see whether we could expand Løgstrup's thinking to also cover animals. And I actually think we succeeded. We wrote a paper a couple of years ago called The Ethical Demand and Broiler Chickens, where we looked into the welfare problems of broiler chickens. And if you remember Løgstrup's first claim that we always have something of the other's life in our hand, that is very, very clear when we talk about domesticated animals. We actually have all their lives in our hands. We are deciding how they fare because we have taken all the power. And if that in the human sphere is followed by a responsibility for how we use that power, then we think it goes almost without saying that it also pertains to animals. Because what is the difference between the human-centered ethics and the animal-centered ethics? Well, basically you could say, well, humans interact, right? So I can take responsibility for you and vice versa. That doesn't really happen with a chicken or a salmon, right? I can take responsibility for the animal. The animal doesn't understand it should take responsibility for me. But that's the same when we interact with a lot of humans, right? Actually, we are a very small collected group here tonight who can interact in that way. There are very many humans who can't do that. Small children, severely demented, severely mentally ill people don't interact with us in that way. There we say we have the responsibility even though they can't reciprocate. So in that sense, we think we can do this with animals as well. The question then obviously becomes what animals, right? What animals are relevant here? And that is a very, very long discussion. Most of us will accept that mammals are relevant because mammals experience their life. They can fare better or worse, and they experience that. And to a growing degree within animal welfare science, it's accepted that fish carry the same capacity to have welfare, that it makes meaning to talk about fish welfare. Even though you still, when you talk, especially at public places, and you say, and tonight I'll talk about fish welfare, people can, that's funny, right? Fish can have welfare. No, because everybody who's tried to say I'm a vegetarian has tried to have fish served to them, right? Because we see fish as swimming vegetables, basically. But it seems they can have welfare. Okay, but why should we then aim for welfare? Why is that relevant? Why should we look at fish and think, okay, we have some kind of responsibility? Well, there is one reason that I think carries a lot of weight in the Western world, the enlightened world: money, right? Because it might increase production. And therefore we should be concerned about welfare, because if fish fare well, we make more money out of them. And if that doesn't count in itself, then there are the consumer concerns. So we actually run the risk of earning less money if consumers begin questioning the welfare of the animals we are harvesting from the ocean and won't buy them. So there's a very, you can say, selfish reason to be concerned about animal welfare. But we could obviously also be concerned about the animals as ethical beings, as beings that we are in some sort of relationship with, where it makes sense to talk about responsibility. And then there is the wonderful situation where we can have both, right? Where we are concerned about animals in and of themselves, and we want to make money, and it turns out we can take care of the animals and we make more money. This is popularly known as a win-win situation. And I don't know about you, but I'm really good at handling win-win situations in my own life. I rarely fail, right? But obviously we have to ask some questions there about the welfare, because often we're talking about we have fish in a certain way, and now we want to look at the welfare, exciting. But what's the starting point? What should we compare with? It is what we have today, and then say, okay, if we can make it a little bit better, we have increased welfare. Or should we look at wild fish? Or should we look at the optimal conditions we could keep a fish under and say, this is what we measure ourselves against? And if we can't reach the optimal, what then? How should we balance the interest? How should we make that balancing between making money and fish welfare when they don't, when we have a win-lose situation? Who should win and who should lose? So far, in the Western world, when we look at industrial agriculture, the animals have lost because we have been setting the criteria and asking the questions. Okay, still not working, great. So, what is animal welfare? Because I said we can agree on animal welfare, we should have more, shouldn't we have more animal welfare? Do you dare to disagree in a public space? No, obviously not. And there's different, you can call it paradigms or sort of ways to, bringing a new projector. It was actually some very good slides, I'll admit. So what I have done is I have taken one of the sort of most, I don't know if you can call most used ways of sort of distinguishing between them, and I have stolen this from Fraser et al. From a paper in Animal Welfare, Journal Animal Welfare, back in 1997.
Just restart PowerPoint for a second.
Yes, we can.
Sorry about this.
Yeah, it's okay. I only go stronger in my belief that it's a good idea we are leaving more and more of our lives to technology. So. I think it's that one.
Yes. I get this file. It's about time to only use Max.
Yeah, I have the same problem.
Is it one of these?
It's the top one.
To know which.
Yeah. I can find the one I reached. Okay, so there are sort of three types of concern or three ways of thinking about animal welfare that is identified within this sort of way of organizing it. The first one is called natural living, where the sort of basic idea is that each being has a certain nature, a certain way of being in the world. With a Greek word, we can call it telos. It's a goal. There's something this being is supposed to unfold. And what we're concerned about within the natural living paradigm when we look at welfare is that the animal has the ability to unfold this distinctive kind of being. So pigs should be able to root in the ground, chickens should be able to do what chickens do, dogs should be able to sniff people's groins, whatever it is that particular animal is doing, right? So you can say in a sort of more scientific sense, we talk about that the animal should perform its species-specific behavior in an evolutionary context. If we talk to people on the street, they say animals should live natural lives. That's how we find out whether they have welfare or not. Another paradigm is called the feelings-based paradigm, and there the focus is on the affective experiences of the animal. Mostly the concern have been that there should be an absence of negative experiences, so pain, distress, boredom, and so on. And more within animal welfare research, past 10, 15 years, there has been an attention to that there should be a presence of positive experiences, so that could be comfort, contentment, pleasure, and so on. But what's important here is not whether the animal lives a natural life or not, it's how the animal experiences the situation. I read about a research project a couple of years ago where they tried to make a computer game, an interactive computer game between children and pigs. So the children could sit at home with their PlayStations, and there would be a camera in the barn, or whatever you call it, the production system. So the pigs would be able to see a screen where the children could move sort of little lighting dots around on the screens, and the pigs would get curious and try to touch those dots with their snouts. And that gave them something to do, instead of just biting each other's tails. So the pigs had a better life. Children probably thought it was fun, and we can learn about pigs. Probably sneak in some education while they think they're playing, like we usually do. And it's, you can say, well, it's very unnatural for a pig to run around trying to sort of touch a moving dot on a screen that's controlled by a child who's sitting in Hong Kong. Yes, but who cares as long as the child finds it interesting and the pig finds it interesting. So there's no concern about naturalness, only how the animal experiences the situation. The third paradigm is called the functioning-based paradigm, and that's where our concern is that the animal is perceived to have sort of an ideal or at least a normal functioning of its biological systems. So we look at, is the animal healthy? Are there diseases? Is it growing as it's supposed to do? Does it have the offspring it's supposed to have? Is the quality of the products good enough, right? Because we also have this sort of sentiment that an animal that has had a good life is an animal that tastes well afterwards. Have you met that? In Denmark, there was a commercial a couple of years ago that said, happy cows give good milk. Right? And I've met a million people who sit down at the table, sink their teeth into meat of some kind and say, oh, this was a happy animal. Right? And I'm thinking, no, you're a happy animal. But let's leave that. So there's typically also a focus on the shelter. How do we keep the animals? How do we feed them? Do they have enough health care and so on? And these are three very different ways of looking at animal welfare. I mean, if I ask you, go and measure animal welfare out there at these animals, right? You could come with three perspectives and you would measure very different stuff. And sometimes you would find the same because obviously they sort of go together, that if the animal is in dire pain all the time from a disease, it's probably not having very nice affective states and it's probably not able to perform its species-specific behavior. But sometimes they sort of differ. Sometimes giving the animals the opportunity to live natural lives, or as natural as they can be, might make them, at least some of them, feel less positive states than they could have because they're not protected. For instance, from feeling hungry sometimes if they are outside not being fed all the time as they are inside and so on. If we look at who has which perspective, it seems that when we ask citizens, what do you think animal welfare is? You get sort of a combination of the natural living paradigm and the feelings-based paradigm. And if we ask people within the production sector, from farmers to veterinarians, they are typically very much into the functioning-based paradigm and also looking into the feeling-based paradigm, mostly trying to avoid negative states. We can find this also not only in science, but also sort of more popular. Back in 1964, a British, I think she was a veterinarian called Ruth Harrison, published a book called Animal Machines, where she described how animals lived in the, at that point, rather new intensive production systems. And that book caused sort of a lot of uproar in the public because at least they pretended they had no idea that we treated animals like that now. And the government was like, oh, we're concerned, we should do something, so we'll make a committee, as governments do. And please take a lot of time in the committee. And they did. And they came out with a report called the Bramble Report. And based on that, something called the Universities Federation for Animal Welfare, UFAV, later established something which is called the 5 freedoms, which some of you might have heard, and which is sort of a paradigm within animal welfare. And you can find organizations saying we live up to the 5 freedoms. And the 5 freedoms is that the animal should be free from hunger and thirst, free from discomfort, free from pain, injury, or disease, free to express normal, not natural, but normal behavior, and free from fear and distress. So if you provide that to the animals, the freedom from a lot of negative things, and then the opportunity to perform normal behavior, whatever that might be, then the animal fares well. This has been criticized, especially for having such a large focus on negative experiences, right? Avoiding those. So in 1997, Miller and Reed suggested something called the 5 domains model, and that has then been sort of expanded on and rethought several times. I found a paper by Miller from 2020 on the 5 domains model. But what they basically say is there are four areas of the animal's life we should look into, because all these areas affect the mental state of the animal. So we should look into the nutrition that the animal is provided with, the environment we provide for the animal's health, and the animal's behavior. And by looking into those, we have a chance for having an idea of what is the mental state of the animal. Okay, so that's one way of trying to say, is an animal faring well? Well, let's look at the behavior. figure out what to compare it with, and then we have an idea. Let's look at what we feed it compared to what we know about its nutritional needs. Let's look at the environment we are placing it in compared to the environment it evolved in, which it's typically built for. It has some capacities to solve issues within that. And let's look at the health of the animal, and based on that we can say something about the welfare of the animal. How should we then ensure animal welfare? Well, obviously that depends very much on what we understand animal welfare to be. So there's not one answer how to ensure and improve animal welfare. Well, that depends on what kind of animal welfare perspective you bring to the table. But for all these perspectives, I would say, and I'm trying not to go too much into Herwig's and Bernice's talks, but there are some common questions here. And one would be when we talk about using CRISPR technologies for changing the animals. There's a basic questions where we could basically say, well, should animals fit the machine, or should the machine fit the animals, right? And what we're doing when we're making breeding, using breeding technologies, whether they be conventional or CRISPR-based, gene editing, gene modification, we are basically trying to change the animal to fit into the production system, right? So we are taking, as Bernard Rollin, an American animal ethicist, said, we're taking square pegs and trying to put into round holes, and it doesn't really work. So what we're doing is that we're sort of chopping away at the pegs to make them fit the holes, instead of changing the box with the holes we're trying to put them into. And is there an ethical limit to this? Where should we stop? Is there a welfare limit? Is there some point where we must say the animals fare so bad now, even though we are making more and more money, that we should stop? Is there such a limit? Does it exist? Like when you use laboratory animals, you typically have a humane endpoint. So before you begin your experiment, you set up a point in time where when the animal reaches this state, it might be the size of the tumor that you have inflicted the animal with, then we kill the animal, because then it becomes too painful. Do we have such a place, such a line within production animals? What about all the risks that we know about and don't know about? The unknown unknowns with CRISPR, it's very much a discussion around off-target effects, which I think we will get into in the second part tonight, so I won't go into that. But Bjørn said that it was a very precise technology, but it seems to me, at least when I read papers on these gene editing technologies, that there are a lot of questions about off-target effects, where you get the change you want, but you also get other changes. And then technologies. What kind of technologies can we use for this? Is it okay to use sort of the biblical way, where you go into your fields and look at the animals and say, that one and that one should mate? Or can we use more sophisticated technologies? Can we map the genomes of the animals and then pair them based on that? Or can we actively go and change the genome, which is the idea of CRISPR? And are there other ethical issues that are relevant besides welfare that we have to take into account? The sort of basic instrumentalization that lies in this, that we're taking the animal and turning it into an object that is to serve our needs, instead of being concerned about the animal as something that's important in itself. What about the death of the animal, both the ones that die during the process of breeding them to become a certain kind of animal, but also all the animals that this will feed into an industry that is basically based on killing them? Is that an ethical issue at all? And what about the integrity of the animal? Is there such a thing? Is there something about that there's a degree to which we can't change the animal, even though it doesn't affect the experience of the animal, the feeling-based perspective, but it would still be wrong? An example of that is a couple of years old, where I think it was a Dutch philosophy student who suggested that we should make chickens without brains. Right? So we could just sort of keep the basic functions of sort of growth, we could take the rest away, put them into a machine, and we could raise animals who didn't feel any pain because we removed that part of the brain. Right? So there's no welfare issue here, but it's okay to do it like that. So the question here, especially when we look at that this project is layered within the salmon industry in Norway, I think is, can it be ethically justified to alter the genome of the salmon through gene editing technologies with the mutual aims of improving animal welfare and production efficiency. And the question from philosophy must be, it depends. Thank you.
That presentation without the PowerPoint. The first slide looked really nice. I wish we could have seen the rest. Is there any hope for this, or should we wait to see if it works before I introduce Bernice? Okay. Huh?
We're not really sure where the casualty is, so it might be another computer that could work better.
Okay. Okay, so we give them a minute to try. Yeah. Yeah?
Ask if anybody has any questions.
Does anybody have any questions to Mickey? If so, we can take some questions straight away. Håvard has a question.
So we heard that there's a lot of problems with the concept of animal welfare. What else? What else should we use? Have we other concepts that are more suited for this?
You don't. I mean, it's a valid concern. I mean, we shouldn't sort of say it's not interesting then because it's not clear. It's like sustainability. It's extremely important, but we just have to accept it's a rather vague concept. So I think what can be done is whenever you say animal welfare, you say, and by that I mean, and then you explain it at least, because then at least we have a clearer discussion. One of the most frustrating things is working not as much as a researcher, but more as a, I don't know, academic activist within this area, is that I agree with everyone. I mean, even my most dire opponents agree with me that we should have more animal welfare. So we can stand in public meetings and, oh, we should have animal welfare. Yes, animal welfare, right? Because we don't talk about what we mean when we say animal welfare. But as soon as we do that, it turns out we actually disagree. There's something to discuss. What is important, what is not important. So I think that's the lesson to take from this. It's not giving up on the concept, because I think it's extremely important how animals fare, especially when we have taken power over them. But we should at least be clear what we mean when we say animal welfare, so as not to sort of, I mean, it can very easily be kind of a welfare washing thing, right? Where we sort of seem like we're concerned about animal welfare. But if it turns out that animal welfare always go hand in hand with what we can make more money of, then perhaps we aren't interested in animal welfare. We're just saying that because it sounds nicer. Hope that was an answer. Good.
Any other questions from any members of the audience? Yeah.
Could it be that this conflict in you is because of the term natural?
The term natural is very problematic in itself. And I mean, at least philosophers aren't the what you say in Norway, the fastest mopeds on the harbor. But even philosophers discovered 500 years ago that nature and natural is very problematic concepts to roll out. But I think in this context, turning it into a question of the animal living alive in a way where it can unfold its species-specific behavior and meet the challenges that it evolved to meet, could be a description of natural. Then you can say, but why is that good? Because that's the big question. Why is natural good? Because earthquakes are natural. We don't find them good. And there within animal welfare, you could say, well, to some extent, the animal being able to do that goes hand in hand with positive experiences, that if a pig can't root in the ground, it becomes frustrated and have a negative experience. But sometimes it might not lead to positive, but to negative experience. Establishing a flock hierarchy, for instance, is probably not very nice for the animals who end up at the bottom, right? But it's still part of a natural behavior. And there is a division where some would say, then it's not important because it has nothing to do with welfare, because that's what's in the mind of the animal, where others would say, no, that's how it is to be that kind of animal, so it should be able to do that. And that's a way of trying to get around the sort of natural concept. Yeah, they muted you. I'm sorry.
Round, but it seems like we have the PowerPoint back. So I would like to please give Mickey Gjerris a warm applause for his presentation. And I would like to welcome to the stage Bernice Bovenkerk. She is Associate Professor at the Wageningen University, and she works within animal and environmental ethics and political philosophy, and questions such as animal agency, animal domestication, biotechnology, and the moral status of so-called boundary animals such as fish and insects. Please welcome Bernice.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Well, I'm glad it's my turn now, because if Mickey would have kept on talking, he would have done my whole presentation with all your questions about naturalness and stuff. So we'll be getting back to that as well. So thanks very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to interested audiences about these things. And I suppose I should have really raised my hand when Mickey was asking who wants less welfare, because I'm going to talk about arguments beyond welfare. It's not so much that I want less welfare, of course, but I think welfare is not the only thing that matters morally. And I guess Mickey and I agree with each other on that. So you talked about animal welfare being a fuzzy concept. And even though it is acknowledged as highly important, not only by audiences that we talk to, but also by practically all animal ethicists out there. All theories in animal ethics think that animal welfare or guaranteeing animal welfare is important. So that raises the question, why shouldn't we focus or limit the ethical discussion to animal welfare? And I know there are some people in the audience that think we should, but I think if ethics is restricted to animal welfare, then there are two problems with that. First of all, we ask too much from the concept of welfare. We stretch it too much to include all sorts of concerns that in the end, I think, do not necessarily have to do with welfare. But also, secondly, we overlook legitimate arguments beyond welfare. Of course, Mickey was already arguing that welfare is a concept that has been expanded. So, for example, positive experiences are taken more seriously now. That's why I included that picture. I thought I'm in Norway. I should include this picture of a happy animal. But there are legitimate other arguments beyond welfare. And when we're talking about genetic modification, even if a specific genetic modification doesn't actually cause any welfare problems, which it often doesn't, then still many people have moral qualms about it. And so I think it's important, at least because people have these moral qualms about it, to investigate what those qualms rest on, if they are legitimate or not. So if we look at welfare again, or even a broader conception of welfare that we sometimes call well-being, then that concerns the animal's subjective experiences. But some moral discussions are not really about how animals experience things, but about how humans experience what we do to animals. And so they are more about our worldviews, they're about views of what is the proper human-animal relationship, and what is the good life, basically. And those tend, to refer, of course, to welfare, but they go beyond that. So in the literature, you see sort of 4 clusters of arguments or objections to genetic modification, and actually also often breeding, selective breeding of animals. And these are objections that go beyond welfare. There are 4 clusters, which I'm going to very briefly, because I only have 15 minutes, I'm going to very briefly go into them. The first is that it would violate integrity. Luckily, Mickey already said something about it, so I don't have to say too much, hopefully. Secondly, that it would instrumentalize animals. Thirdly, that it amounts to playing God. That's something, an argument that you hear often as well. And that it's unnatural. And then afterwards, I will ask the question, what should we actually make of these arguments? What is the upshot of these arguments? I think they can be traced to worldviews or notions of the good life. But a problem is, and like Mickey already said, we all have broad consensus that animal welfare is important, even though we don't have consensus on exactly what welfare means. But we all think welfare is important. And there is not such broad consensus on these other arguments or objections beyond welfare. Still, I think it is important to discuss these objections publicly. So let's have a look at the first cluster. Well, genetic modification violates animals' integrity is something that you can come across. Well, what does integrity actually refer to? It has been defined as the wholeness and intactness of an animal, its species-specific balance, and the capacity to sustain itself in an environment suitable to the species. And so just to give a couple of examples, here you see a Belgian blue cow, which has been bred to generate a lot of meat, and it's so big that basically the mothers can't really give birth naturally, normally. I mean, sometimes they can. There are some veterinary ethicists here, so I have to be careful with what I say. But generally, they have to give birth using a cesarean. That means they can't really sustain themselves in an environment suitable to their species. Similarly, with sterile fish. So that's one proposal that we see now, that we should make salmon, for example, sterile. Genetically modified salmon should be sterile so that when they escape from their aqua farm, they don't actually interbreed with wild salmon. Now, on the one hand, you could say that's a very good idea. On the other hand, from the perspective of integrity, you could say, well, here again, you're creating a species that is not able to sustain itself in an environment suitable to it. Because, well, they're not sustaining themselves at all. They're not procreating. Now, when you talk about integrity, it seems to refer to sort of a biological norm because it refers to intactness and stuff of an animal. But actually, if you think further about it, it primarily refers to an intention behind an action. Just an example to make that clear, if you have a dog that has an infection or an inflammation on his tail, then you can dock the tail. That is not considered a violation of that dog's integrity. But if you do it for aesthetic purposes, just because you think it's beautiful, then you would consider it a violation of integrity. So that argument really doesn't refer to the interference as such, but the motivation behind the interference. Also, it seems to refer to sort of a species-typical norm, the, so to speak, cowness of a cow or the chickenness of a chicken. It refers to an ideal image that people have of what that animal should look like. Often that's not really what animals are like anymore after selective breeding, but this idea that they have an integrity that can be violated refers to this sort of ideal image of, say, this cow that you see here. Now, this, I can't go into this deeply, but this whole notion of integrity has been criticized by many animal ethicists. It seems quite difficult to theoretically justify it, but it still appeals to an intuition that a lot of people have, that we should not tamper with animal genomes. And also, especially in the Netherlands, where I come from, you see that it actually is used in practice. So, for example, we used to have this committee for animal biotechnology that had to approve licenses for biotechnological procedures with animals, and they didn't only look at the welfare implications of those procedures, but they also asked themselves the question, does this interference actually violate the integrity of the animal? And they found it actually quite a workable concept. Now, the second one is that it would instrumentalize animals. And this is actually a cluster of objections. So first of all, objectification is one of those terms that often is used. Commodification, turning an animal into a commodity. Alienation, alienating the animal from, well, their own nature. And de-animalization. That's something that Mickey, for example, is also discussing in the literature. Now, you can see that there are sort of two general meanings of this. The first one is treating the animal as if it were an object, and the second is as if turning the animal into sort of an object, into an artifact. And I had a little film clip. I don't know if it, I'm really afraid to try anything, but let's see if it, no. I think I have to go out of, let's see. I just wanted to run this in the back just so that you get an idea about what animal objectification or instrumentalization looks like, but you can't see it, can you? You can hear it. Okay, I'll leave then. I have to drag. Ah. Yeah, it's coming there. This is also dubbed the chicken roller coaster. Yeah, it's small here, but I think you can still see it. So the idea here is these are one-day-old male chicks. They are killed when they are 1 day old because they are the chicks of layer hens. And of course, they don't lay eggs because they're male. So they are considered surplus animals. You can't use them anymore to lay eggs when they grow older. You can't really use them to as broiler chickens to produce meat either because they don't grow fast enough. So that's not efficient enough. And this is basically, this shows what happens to them. They end up on a conveyor belt, they get handled, they get thrown around, and then here they go through, here they're still alive actually, yeah. Maybe I should stop it here, if I can. Now that's the main question, of course, can I stop it? At least you can't see it anymore now, you can still hear it. Sorry? Does anybody know how to get back? Now, why I'm showing this is that, that image is very powerful, I think, of the conveyor belt. That really sends the message of, these are animals that are actually regarded as objects and treated as objects. And it's not so much a welfare problem, actually. Your first thought might be, that's really sad for the little chicks. But their death is actually, I think this is now Herwig's. Sorry. their death is actually very swift, depending on how they do it. They tend to, yes, thank you. They tend to use CO2 these days in the Netherlands, which is a bit less swift, but it's, I would say, not in the first place a welfare problem, but the problem that many people have with this, and many people in the Netherlands, when they saw this footage, really protested against it. And the problem is that it really instrumentalizes animals. Yes. Sorry, thank you. Thank you very much. I just skip. Yes. Okay. Now, why would that be problematic? Because when you're treating an animal as if it is an object, that sort of leads to a denial of its own interests or its own nature or its own autonomy. When you turn the animal into an object, whether you do so intentionally or not, that means that the animal is actually treated as if it were an artifact or an instrument for our use. And that means that animals become living parts of machinery. They're sort of adapted to fit into our production systems. That's what Mickey was already saying before. Just to give an example, if you genetically modify a pig so that he or she can't get PERV, which is porcine endocrine respiratory virus, I think. So that's a virus that you encounter very commonly in pig husbandry systems, but it seems to be mainly caused by the fact that they are such dense, overcrowded systems. What you then do to ameliorate that situation is genetically modifying the animal so that they can't get that disease. So that would be, I think, an example of adapting the animal to fit our production systems. Now, it could be that you don't agree on the empirical part of this, but this is basically what animal ethicists argue, that we shouldn't do this. We should rather fit the situation of the animal to the animal's needs. And here, again, their own subjectivity or their own autonomy is denied, and they're not basically seen as individuals, but they're seen as replaceable, as units in a production system, where you have input on one side, you just put in some food, animals in between, something comes out, meat, manure first, then meat or milk, and that animal is just part of that machine. So this is actually based not so much on a welfare argument, but on what they call an animal rights argument. So we shouldn't really use other animals solely as instruments for our own use, but also acknowledge that they have goals in their life. So it's not just our goals that matter, but also the goals of those animals themselves is the idea behind this. The third objection is the idea that we would be playing God if we're genetically modifying animals. And that argument, you could say, rejects sort of the intervention into the order of creation, and it also expresses an intuition that certain boundaries shouldn't be crossed by humans. And now often people respond to this sort of argument by saying, yeah, but I'm not religious, so why would I care? But it is not actually in the first place a religious argument. It's not meant as a religious argument. It is really an argument about the proper role of human beings within nature, or of human beings vis-a-vis technology. And it is an argument that rejects the pretension of control or almightiness that human beings have when they are using this type of technology. It refers to what they call human hubris, or in other words, arrogance of humans to think that they can control something that they might not know all the negative consequences of, the unknown unknowns that Mickey was talking about before. So what really is behind this argument is the idea that life cannot be manufactured. Not so much that because there is a God that manufactures life, not necessarily, but because we are not gods. Now finally, the argument that it would be unnatural to interfere with the genome of an animal. And that rests on the idea that certain natural boundaries, for example, boundaries between the species, have been crossed. Now, a common response to that argument is that, well, there are no species boundaries on the genome level, which is true, of course, but that's not the point. That argument misses the point. The point, I think, of this argument is that it would never, not that it would never happen in nature, but that interfering itself by humans is seen as unnatural. Now, of course, like Mickey was already saying, unnatural doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? That's something that indeed philosophers have known for a long time, and they refer to the naturalistic fallacy when they talk about this. Basically, you're making an argumentative fallacy if you're just saying that something that happens in nature is therefore automatically good. And many things happen in nature that are not good, or that we would not take as a norm for our actions. So, for example, an orca plays very violently with a seal before it eats it. But that doesn't mean that we also get to play with our food before we eat it. That's not a norm for our action. So why then use this argument? Shouldn't we just reject this argument because it's unnatural, it's wrong? Well, the argument still keeps on popping up. And you might wonder why I've got a picture of these cute dogs here. I actually did some research into pedigree dog breeding, and I asked many people who own dogs, but also breeders, show judges, people like that. I asked them what they thought of all different types of dogs and things we do with dogs, like putting little jackets and clothes on them, for example, carrying them around in a handbag, or perhaps, breeding a dog that looks like a zebra dog, striped dog, or something like that. I found during that research that there are dogs that already look like that, so I didn't know that. But that was our question to them, and a lot of people actually came up with the argument that it was unnatural to do that, and that is why they found that problematic. So it seemed to express a very deeply felt intuition, and so we probed them a bit more on that. We were not like the typical philosopher who say, well, that's, you say it's unnatural, you're using the naturalistic fallacy. And we're asking them why, what is so bad about that? It turned out that it really relied on underlying views that people had about our relation to animals, and they rejected this instrumental vision on nature and animals that we already saw with that with the previous objection against instrumentalizing animals. So there's a lot of overlap actually between all these arguments. They also tended to show a lot of respect for evolutionary processes. So they said things like, well, evolution has taken 10,000 years to do this. Why do we think that we can do it in just one generation? So again, that also goes back to the playing God argument, the hubris or arrogance argument. Okay, so I've discussed these 4 different types of arguments, and then the question is, what is actually the upshot of these arguments? They tend to rely a lot on intuition, like I explained, and they are based on how we view animals and how we view human-animal-nature relationships, and more broadly, what we see as the good life. And so if we look at the integrity argument and the instrumentalization argument, you see that they are based on an idea that animals have intrinsic value, and they also are based on ideas about what is an ideal type of animal, the cowness of the cow. When we look at playing God and naturalness, we see that this expresses a view on the more modest role that we humans should take vis-à-vis nature. And so it really goes back to a broader conception of the good life. Now, like I said at the start, there is a lot more consensus on welfare, that we should be guaranteeing animals' welfare. And there's not so much consensus on these arguments beyond welfare, and that's because they're based on fundamental values that people hold and on which they differ. And also because I think they do not provide clear rules for action. So for example, in that example that I had about the pedigree dogs and the dog breeding, people tended to say, well, it's unnatural, and then we asked, well, does that mean it's not allowed? And they're like, well, it's not that it's not necessarily allowed, but there are certain boundaries. There's certain things that you shouldn't do. You shouldn't go as far as modifying them to for example, only live 2 years old until they're 2 years old. The so-called disposable puppy case that animal ethicists like to discuss. So people had a very strong intuition that that was going too far, but because it was unnatural. But unnaturalness didn't mean that nothing was allowed. And so it didn't really provide clear rules for action. So it's even more fuzzy, supposedly, than the welfare issue. But that doesn't necessarily make them less important, in my view, because conceptions on the good life actually motivate people, and many of our most deeply felt beliefs and views are motivated by these ideas on the good life. And I think, therefore, we need to discuss them. Respect for other people already implies that we should take these views seriously. And taking them seriously doesn't necessarily mean acting by them, but it means at least listening to where other people come from and why they think that's important. So arguments beyond welfare should be more subject of public debate. They tend to be relegated a little bit to the private sphere. It's something that, we can't, it doesn't generate clear rules for action. We can't have consensus on it. It goes back to your deep values. You should just discuss it among yourself and not out in the open. But that's, I think, really problematic. I think we really need a broad reflection on what kind of world we want to live in. And because that is what really motivates us when we're thinking about how to deal with animals. When Ruth Harrison, what Mickey was already saying, when she wrote her book about animal machines, I think people's intuitions were not just that it was bad for the animals' welfare, but it was also bad that we were turning the animals into machines. And that's, they didn't really do anything with that intuition. They went straight to, okay, so we have to do something with welfare. We have to define welfare and see where that takes us. But maybe we should now also see where these arguments beyond welfare take us. Okay, that was all I had to say. Thank you. Should I go?
Thank you very much.
Or should I go?
Maybe we will take questions in the end.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Bernice. And I would like to introduce now Harvey Grimm. He's a professor of ethics and animal studies at the University of Vienna. He is a trained farmer and a philosopher. And his research interests include methodological questions in practice-oriented ethics, agricultural ethics, and animal ethics. So please give Herwig a warm round of applause.
Not there yet. Oh, that one, yeah. This one? This one, yeah. Right in front of you. Okay, so thank you for the very warm welcome. My pleasure to be here, and yeah, beautiful. Thank you very much. Yep. Here are the slides. And yeah, and actually, I was at the point of saying, well, I would like to summarize now what my and bring it in a context that is often not so seen as a very important one, but it's veterinary medicine, and it's one field I'm working in. And this is why the subtitle of my presentation is On the Ethics of Genome Editing in Veterinary Medicine. So I'm going to contextualize more of this, what you already heard, I think. And I will directly approach the question whether we should edit animals or edit our attitudes towards them. And this resembles nicely what you just heard. I'm going to proceed in 3 steps. First, a very brief introduction on veterinary ethics and the best interest principle as a key factor there, and xenonomy. Xenonomy is an ugly word, I know, and you might not have heard of it. We invented it to bring all these points that were already addressed, this idea of the not the interest of the animal, but if you take the attitude of doing something with the animal, trying to shape them according to your goals, then this is xenonomy. I will come to that in a minute. Then I would like to introduce you to the ethical Delphi that we carried out, and that's actually the book that we published on it. We did a survey, a little one, on genome editing. I'm going into that. From Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and then I come back to the question of editing animals or editing the attitudes, and with that I would like to address the questions that Björn put to us. Is it socially and morally acceptable to use genome editing on animals, and in which circumstances is it? Right, so first of all I would like to start with veterinary ethics and the best interest principle. Who of you has a dog or a cat or some, right. What would you expect if you come to a vet? What should the vet do? May I ask you? You raised your hand. Heal, basically help. Yeah? So yeah, and this is what also people say if you ask them, and we conducted some research on this, of course, but this is not the only view. I will come to that in a minute. But basically you can say, well, there is a strong tendency that we expect vets to help our animals, to act in the favor of them. So the patient's best interest is a very strong motivator, and I put this in the following slide. So what do we expect from a veterinarian? And here is an antique guy trying to put the scales into the favor of patient-centered factors in the clinic and holding against others like financial limitations, convenience, career building, and so forth. So we picture vets as those who keep up the interests of the animal. But is there a vet in the room? Yeah. Right. You will, I hope you will already have your doubts. Because if we look at the various contexts of veterinary medicine, we see, well, the companion animals are not the only animals that vets treat. We find farm animals, zoo animals, public health, lab animals, and so forth. And in these areas, well, let's start with the companion animals. Yeah, there's the patient's health and well-being. Okay. But when it comes to farm animals, and this is already touching on things that you heard, it's not the animal's health and well-being itself, but the animal's health and well-being as a means to human ends. Let's say functionality and economic prosperity. Yeah? That is the point, the functional paradigm in animal welfare. And if you go to public health issues, it's not even the health or well-being as a means, but actually it's health and well-being of others. Take a zoonotic outbreak, a zoonosis, when you eradicate a farm, it's also healthy animals that are destroyed and eradicated. So it's not about taking care or healing them. Actually, legally, it's actually forbidden to heal them. You have to eradicate them. So this is also an expectation, and in numbers, these sectors are far bigger than that. Okay, so we come up with a different view of the vet. Health as a means for others' ends. Right, and from this one can say, well, I'm making it very simple here. Yeah? We have two ways of approaching animals here. You could translate now the best interest principle, so the patient's interest, into veterinary action, or you could translate the other's goals into practice. Yeah? And this is what I call xenonomy. And what do I mean by that? So that's an attitude, and I explicitly speak about an attitude here, towards animals that translates into perceiving, treating, and shaping human-animal interaction as other-directed. So it's not directed towards the animal, but other-directed. You see the point? So this is, I'm doing a black and white game here, just to make our debate hopefully more interesting. Then, so what actually happens when we follow a xenonome, human-animal relationship? We are trying to put animals, and we had the metaphor already, that are visualized with a circle here, into squares. But this not always works well. Right. when we put other directed attitude into our human-animal relationship, sometimes this causes trouble. Causes trouble, for example, on the welfare. And our question for our little empirical survey was whether genome editing does actually increase or decrease these xenonome idea in human-animal relationship. And what we did here was, and I'm coming to the project that we did, and we carried it out in 2019, we did a little, what we call an ethical Delphi, and we invited veterinarians to comment on genome editing methods in research. So we asked only vets who were working or still working in the field with genome editing methodologies. And we put basically the question to them, which specific applications of genome editing are realistic at all, and to what extent are these morally desirable or undesirable? And the first result I would like to share with you, not very surprising, we asked them what their basic assessment is. What's their basic assessment? We explicitly said, well, it's not easy to put this all these different methodologies into one bucket, but please try. And we got a very positive result here. So we put a Likert scale to them, completely positive, rather negative. Well, nobody, and it was only 13, you saw that. It's an explorative study, nothing representative or anything. So 92% said, well, positive, completely positive, 8%. Well, this is not so surprising. And of course, I would like to show you precise data on Atlantic salmon. However, in Austria and Switzerland, salmon doesn't play such a huge role, I must confess. But so I thought it might be interesting for you to hear about the context where production animals are used. So that's the farming context. And we put worst and best case scenarios to these researchers in the ethical Delphi to see what are their expectations if they think about the best way to go forward and what are worst case scenario. And I'm only sketching here. We did that for lab animals, companion animals, and so forth. And I'm sketching here the best case scenarios. This is why you see the green check here. So one of them was eradication of hereditary disease and genetic defects. That was mentioned very often. Another one, more animal-friendly alternatives to invasive interventions. You saw maybe on the book cover the dehorned, and this, the dehorned cow or cattle that was very often mentioned to get breeds that you don't need to burn out their horn butts, but you could breed them in a way that they don't develop those. Improve disease resistance. These were the best case scenarios, and I think they are realistic scenarios, and I put one example answer here. For example, chickens that are resistant to influenza infections, this would have a huge impact on poultry production while massively reducing the risk of zoonosis. I think these are valid arguments here. When we come to the worst case scenario, and I said I'm only sketching here and giving you some food for thought here. Worst case scenario, one of the dominant fear that was raised, although they were all very positive, as you saw, about genome editing, even stronger focus on economy and performance. And just to give you also a quote on that, so they were referring to classical breeding methods that have produced livestock with extreme performances, but this is often accompanied with reduced fitness. You could also put that now in the welfare terminology that Miki presented. And further enhance the performance. That was something that was seen as a worst case if the physiological balance of the affected organism, if there was an effect, a negative effect on the physiological balance of the affected organism. Such use of the new techniques must be viewed very critically, they say. Okay. So these are the worst case scenarios. But one key argument in the entire ethical Delphi was really that if one looks at the bottom line, what is the key argument and what is the key reason for this positive attitude towards gene editing in general, was, in the view of the respondents, a more efficient, cheaper tool for those goals that have shaped or should shape livestock production to date. So resistance, productivity, animal welfare, etc. And I think there is a risk involved in approaching genome editing in that way. We've seen already quite a few examples of what I call xenonomy. We have a traditional way of organizing human-animal interaction in a xenonome way, which I already presented, so turning the round animals into square production context, for example, that causes problems. And then we have unintended, foreseeable negative consequences, like animal welfare issues. With genome editing, we do have a, and I repeat that effect, we have the opportunity and the chance to turn those round animals directly into squares before we put them into the squares. And this can now be seen as a, for example, a positive effect on the welfare issues, because you don't need, for example, these changes by, for example, dehorning, which are which cause negative effects on the animal welfare. And we deproblematize certain production ideas, production contexts. So this is in the literature very often called a technological fix idea. Yeah? I'm not saying that this technological fix idea is of no value, don't get me wrong here, but we should take care to see what we are doing in human-animal relationship when we apply new technologies. So, bluntly speaking, compared to the gene modification debate, I do not see so many different aspects in the genome editing debate. But what I see, and it was really not easy, you might ask yourself, why did we only ask 13 researchers? Well, we could have also asked citizens, but then at one point we got our heads around that we realized, well, if we ask citizens, they don't have a clue what genome editing is, so why would we ask them? Yeah? Can they really distinguish between breeding methods that are carried out with genome editing and others, and so forth? So this is why we opted for the researchers, or was one reason why we opted for the veterinarians and researchers. But what we see is that, in my view, and this was also what Bernice already mentioned, I think these debates about technology can, of course, work as a catalyst for societal debate and reconsider what we're actually doing with animals in our societies. And what we can say, I think, is that genome editing technologies do carry the risk that developments that are already being criticized could be amplified. Yeah? And I'm not saying, and for example, the positive effect on animal welfare could even stabilize problematic dealings with animals. Do you see the point? So take the 3 R's in the research context, where we could say, well, if we can settle the welfare problem, then it's not so bad. Yeah? But what remains is the attitude that I was pointing at in the beginning. Okay, so in other words, we do have a very powerful technology here, which makes things more efficient, faster, and cheaper. But what do we want to achieve, actually? I think this is the question we should raise and we should bring up to debate. So also question the squares where we put the round animals in. So, to come to my conclusions, in terms of numbers, and I started with veterinary ethics, as you saw, with the best interest principle. In terms of numbers, most veterinary actions are actually not directed towards the best interest principle. Number-wise, we have much more animals on farms, where, and so forth, where it's not about the animals' sake, but others, for the others' sake, what we do. So the other-directed attitude is a dominant attitude in many contexts. And genome editing is very likely to increase these tendencies if the contexts remain unquestioned. However, there is a bright potential, I think, that one could take this emerging technology, well, it's not emerging anymore, but this technology of genome editing and use it as a catalyst to debate and push for a debate where we would like to go in human-animal interaction, and maybe not go that direction and get rid of the problems by reshaping the context and surroundings of the animals. Okay, thank you very much. That was it from my side.
Thank you very much, Herwig. I would like to introduce the next introducer, Håvard Eggesøl from Bioteknologirådet, the Biotechnology Advisory Board.
Thank you so much. And then, yeah, it's on. Good. All right. Thank you so much for some really brilliant talks. It was fascinating to listen, and thank you, Mickey, for handling this situation very elegantly. We are a bit behind schedule, so we are making some some changes to the layout for the evening. So we will first now have some biologists that we have alluded to earlier that will come up and give some commentaries on the lectures we had. And then we'll move on to a debate about animal welfare. And then we will have a second debate about what can we allow us to do with animals. And when it's 15 minutes left of the meeting, we will let all of you in the audience to be a part of the discussion, and we would really like you to take the word and ask our brilliant researchers. Mm-hmm.
While the biotechnologists get up and get ready,
Yes.
have a short break so people can go and have some coffee and
Yep.
some between.
Sure. Research Institute. She has a long experience from research on animal breeding and genetics. Her research interests include aquaculture genetics, access and rights to genetic resources, fish welfare, organic aquaculture, and adoption of breeding techniques. Also joining us at stage is Professor Atle Bunas from NTNU. Please join us. He holds a professorship in cell and molecular biology and genomics, and is experienced in utilizing genome editing for research purposes. His research interests include host defense systems, biotechnology of plants and algae, cellular adoption and acclimatization to environment, abiotic and biotic stresses, cell signaling, and molecular imaging. All right, and last to join us is Trygve Brautaseth. He is also a professor here at NTNU. And in addition, he is a member of the Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board. Trygve is a professor in synthetic biology and focuses on microbial molecular biology with an interest in industrial applications of biotechnology. So I would like to start to give you 1 minute to just give some of your reflections after listening to the lectures. Would you like to start, Ingrid?
Yeah, thank you. I think it was 3 very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. For example, the last about this how the debate about gene editing will affect the whole debate about animal welfare and how we treat them, our attitudes to them. I think that's very interesting, particularly because I think involvement of the public is very important regarding gene editing.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So I haven't thought about that, that it might really have this big impact on the whole debate about how we treat and rear farm animals.
Mm.
Yeah.
Atle, would you like to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I should be a bit more provocative. I don't think philosophers will save many lives or produce much new animals or anything which is going to feed billions of people. And I think I can say that genome editors, they will likely save millions and feed billions. So that could be a start.
Yeah. Trygve, will you follow up on that one?
No, but no, I think that the lectures were interesting with a lot of perspective. One thing is about animal husbandry, which you can criticize for how it is already today, and then start about using CRISPR to improve animals. I think also that the perspective of what can potentially be improved, my perspective from working with microorganisms, we don't have to deal with ethics or welfare or pain or stress, maybe stress, but not the other things with the organisms. But there is really a lot of things you can do with gene technology to improve microorganisms. And I think that if it should be a good debate about how we can use CRISPR-Cas, I think we should look for these win-win situations. Where can we do something that is reasonable for those that farm the animals and that is also good for the animal welfare? And I think that based on all the genome knowledge that we have today, we will find a lot of targets that could potentially fix such things. Yes.
Interesting. All right, then I will welcome up our philosophers once again to the stage, and also Hanna.
You're so tall that you can just stay down there.
So I would like to start with you, Ingrid. You have worked with fish welfare and you are a biologist. So let's start with how can genome editing be used to improve animal welfare?
Yes, I think gene editing can be very important in this regard, particularly as a research tool to gain more understanding and knowledge about how genes are affecting the whole animal, for example, regarding fish health, such that we can learn from this and know how to avoid, prevent diseases.
So a tool to understand the biology and then use conventional farming practices to...
Yeah, that could be one.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, of course, as a breeding tool to improve traits that affect animal welfare. So I've been working a lot with salmon,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some health challenges that might be addressed, but we should also take care that we are not only repairing the symptoms, but also consider the root causes of these problems. So I think it should be to do these research and innovation processes, we should apply these so-called responsible research and innovation processes, where we are anticipative and try to predict the impacts and possible off-target effects that was also mentioned here, and also be reflective, that we look at the drivers or the root causes of the problems, and try to do something with that, and are also involving the public, for example, consumers, and listen to them and learn from them, and also that we, based on all this knowledge, we are able to respond with the research processes, actually, and the innovation. So that might actually change the research or projects, for example, in gene editing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you, Herwig, a question.
Oh my God.
So you come from Austria and you don't have much salmon there. So
That's
this
true.
might be a bit, but I would like to ask you about how does salmon compare to other kind of farmed animals such as cows and pigs in terms of animal welfare? Does this concept mean the same thing in a salmon compared to a cow?
Well, to be honest, when I prepared for the talk and for the discussion, I had a look what we know about fish. And there are some recent studies that they make friends, associations, little groups, and so. And these kind of things really also changed my view, because when I entered the project, and Björn, for example, told me about what salmon is in Norway, I wouldn't understand. For me, that was something to eat and nothing else. But gradually, I discovered what's going on there. Yeah? And so I think one could look at these things in terms of how can we produce food, yeah? But also what do we do within a context. And you were raising this point of how is this connected with culture? And I like this idea and this provocative statement of saying we save millions and feed billions. And I'm on the point using this statement and ask back, who is the we in this statement? If I might jump on that question.
Yeah.
We is the breeders and that part of the population who is working on improving. But I think we can turn it around, because you said the chicken without brain. I think we in future will have plants which produce meat, and we will not need animal in the same way. So in the long run, this domestication of animals for food production will not be necessary. And that's the genome editing and the plant genome editing and the plant genetic engineering people and the synthetic biology people. We are not, this is not going to be solved like this, but it's going to be a long process.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think, you know, when we're talking about in vitro meats, there are great advances already being made. I think we'd probably be better off putting all our money on that than on improving animals, making them more efficient, making them fit into the square holes. And I think even with fish, they're already doing that. There's already chicken on the market, and there are already plant-based alternatives, of course. So if you're talking about feeding millions, then I think feeding them with plants is a much more efficient way of going about it than feeding them with animals.
I can ask a further question. So older, and this goes out to both the philosophers and the biologists, I think. Older gene modification technologies have been met with much public resistance. Is there reason to believe, you think, that CRISPR could be an ethical game changer? And if so, why? Why could this change anything? Yeah.
Yes, so I think the first examples of using traditional GMO like with techniques was doing a lot of very obvious failures by leaving antibiotic resistance genes and making unpredicted disorders in the genomes of the organisms, which typically then was plants. With gene editing, we claim at least to have control, perhaps complete control. So it's, I think it's the technology seems much safer in that respect. But having that said, I think that still gene editing is just a word. It's still use of gene technology. You produce a GMO. So I think that one thing is the laws and the regulation of this. Another thing is the public acceptance of what they want. That might not so fast change. Depends on what is made, I think.
A small correction, it's not genetic engineering all over the world. Different countries have different regulations.
Yes, but it's...
So in Norway, it's genetic engineering.
Yeah.
But in United States, for example, it's not genetic engineering.
Mickey? Yeah, I mean, we have been discussing GMOs, plant-based GMOs since the 80s. And there has been this idea, well, now we come with a new technology, and it's very different. And it doesn't really seem to be catching on besides in the scientific circles where they can see the difference because they're doing something. But as you say, it is publicly considered GMOs. The technical differences doesn't seem, because it's really not about only is it from another species or are we editing the genome of this species. It's about the level of control we take over the organism for a large extent. And I think the only way to make this succeed in a European context is if you can get gene editing out of the gene modification legislation. And I don't see that happening because you have very strong organic farming organizations that say we consider this genetic modification. So in that sense, I think it's an uphill battle. What can happen is two things. You either come up with something that actually feeds hungry people, which genetic technology has been promising since the 70s without doing it. There's more now than ever. That could make an acceptance because it will see as, it's still a problem, but it fulfills a very important need. The other reason is more like when I raised my own kids, that you have been nagging us since the 80s about being able to use the technology. And at some point people go, yeah, then go ahead, please, right? You can have the rabbit, right? Because we heard about it so long and we become more accustomed to it. So that might happen as well. But right now, I don't see gene editing catching on, at least within the EU. You're right, in the US, it's much easier because they don't know what you're eating. So.
In Sweden, too.
Yeah, I think it's important to learn from the history of GMOs and the failures that have been done there. And I'm concerned that if we not changing the way we do the research and innovation on gene editing to become more responsible, where we are more anticipative, reflexive, and involve the consumers and listen to them and actually respond to what they say, and by that aligning the research processes and the outcomes with the values and needs and expectations of the society. I think that this polarized debate will continue. I think it's important that, for example, breeders are able to take into account what the public, consumers, and so on, what they say, and try to adapt. For example, by using the method to improve animal welfare and really go to the causes of the problems, and also by involving them properly and really try to adjust the breeding such that it aligns with what the society needs and wants.
Atle, would like to have a comment?
Yes, I think systems are very conservative. They will we put all the money into old-fashioned stuff, nearly nothing into new developments, and all this nagging about risks and trouble with this. We have now made flavor saver and other genetic engineered organisms since 80s. We have made millions of different genetic engineered plants and other organisms. Can you come up with one example of something which is really has been gone wrong with this? Or is it just nagging from the philosophers?
Well, that's what we do.
All right. We have promised to have some questions from the audience. So is there anyone who wants to ask our panel about something?
I think okay. Oh. I can go around with the microphone in case anyone has any questions.
I have a question to the panelists. I mean, today's topic is talking about the gene editing. The purpose of gene editing should be have at least two. One is for food, one is for medicine. But nobody mentioned about gene editing technology for medicine. So I'm wondering, panel, especially philosophers, what do you think if we're allowed to use gene editing animal models for human medicine? And also veterinary medicine.
May I respond? I think this is and I was at the point of already to question whether the future of genome editing might be similar to genetic modification, where we see in the labs a lot of it, and in the food basically not a lot or none in Europe. And we questioned our only 13 vets doing research in the medical context, how they think about the potentials in the labs, and that was solely positive, to put it in a nutshell. Yeah. However, then I had a look whether this can be substantiated, for example, better models, cheaper models, and quicker, far quicker. And then I went to the lab scientists at my university in Vienna and asked them whether they can provide me with some data and publications on it. They said, well, not so much about it. Yeah, there is not a lot out. And then I found a couple of researchers who are developing models for the lab context. And they said, well, yes, it is, of course, much faster to create mutants. But then to breed out the lines you need, might end up in even using more animals, because you have so many more potentials that you would like to work on and work with. So they were rather hesitant to duplicate this rather or tremendously positive view that I found within the researchers doing it actually.
Mickey, you would like to?
Yeah, I just have a comment.
I think at least if we look at sort of the public acceptance of the use of the technology, if we have anything to go by with the old GM debate, it will be much more positively considered by the public to use it within medicine. Veterinary medicine, I'm not so sure, because a lot of what goes on there is what did you call it, Herwig? The
xenonomy.
Yeah, so we would use it, but not for the benefit of the animal unless it benefits us. But within human medicine, I think there will be a huge acceptance. We have seen that with GM techniques, that there's a much higher acceptance there. So I also see a much brighter, might not be the right word, but unproblematic use of gene editing within medicine than we see within the food sector.
Atle, you would like
Yes, because this is a totally different discussion, because there are so many monogenic traits which are known in human being, like more than 5,000, and which should be low-hanging fruits for improvement of human life. Of course, it takes some time to develop this, but they will come. There will be millions of people who suffer from this monogenic, from sickle cell anemia to other more advanced monogenic diseases. Okay, sickle cell is also advanced. But there will be plenty of people which is going to be saved by this and have a better life for this. But in animal breeding, this situation is totally different, because we don't ask the fish if we have arteriosclerosis or arthrosis or something like that, because there's no way we can feel it. So we have to more kind of measure stress levels or something like that to be able to see if they suffer or not. But we know that they're suffering. We know that animals in the chicken production is not handled well. But we could actually change this situation immediately in farming by going for other type of organisms to feed on. So this is kind of moral, but it's also something we can do something with in not too many years.
We have another question here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm interested. Of course, Ottler says that philosophers haven't really improved anything, and biotechnologists have. But when you look at the numbers of philosophers working in animal ethics and the numbers of biotechnologists, well, I think it's reasonable that you have a better impact than us. But anyway, my question is about salmon and the fish, because that is what I'm kind of interested in. And you said that, well, we should turn to doing something about plants, making them into meat-producing units, and it seems to be a kind of consensus there. But what we're going to live of in Norway when this oil disappears is the salmon farming. So that is kind of our future plans. That is the political plans. And that is, so when we think about what has been done there by systematic breeding projects, then of course that has led to a lot of animal suffering. And now we use genome editing mainly to increase the numbers that we can have, or solve some welfare issues, but at the same time, it seems to be expanding. And if you look at what kind of species that have been accepted for commercial production this far, it's mainly species that are growing faster or getting bigger. So it seems to be something that you say, well, it's for the good, but what is actually happening in genome editing with animals seems to be for the bad. And that is the plans for Norwegian production too. So, what is the logic?
Asking me? Okay, I think you are far away from the situation actually, because I'm working mainly with plant and algae, which is not moving around like this species. But also in animals, you're studying with genome editing the interaction between the environment and the salmon. And the idea, of course, is not to make something trouble for the salmon or make life worse for something. It's to improve it. So making something resistant, for example, against salmon lice would be good. Saving lumpfish will be good. you say there was no product from biotechnology, but of course it will be, it's already like 1.2 billion decars of soybean in the world. It's approximately a little bit lower, but also some similar numbers for maize, for example, which are gene edited, no, not gene edited, genetic engineered. So there are products, big products, and there's plenty of products also for medicine which people, not here, but other places are using.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking that one is that most of the maize and soy that's produced is actually fed to animals and wasted in the process of turning plants into animal proteins. The other thing is that these technologies very rarely feed poor people because poor people don't have any money that sort of signifies them. So we have made products that rich people will buy. And in that sense, I see the Norwegian salmon industry not giving away products to hungry people who have no money. That said, I just have this idea that I mean, I understand the question can be asked. What can we do within salmon industry, breeding, biotechnology to improve welfare? I mean, I can see you can add, it seems like a reasonable question. But on the other hand, I really feel it's like, how can we even ask that? So I came up with an analogy, if I may. When I was a young man, which is about 500 years ago, I did something called a summer camp, a Christian summer camp for sort of children who had a very hard time at home in Copenhagen. So we took them to a place in the countryside. There were 100 children, and we were 10 adults and 15 young people. And then we basically tried to give them a good time. And I remember, this is more than 30 years ago, luckily, that we ate in this huge dining hall like this, right? So we were these 125 people, 3 meals a day, everybody together, singing a little hymn before and after. And I remember the adults, me, being part of discussions of, can we actually smoke before the children have finished their meal, or do we have to wait until we have said thank you for the meal at the table, right? And my feeling now is that somebody is entering the room saying, yeah, because we can actually genetically edit the children to be immune to tobacco smoke, right? Which would be kind of a weird discussion instead of should you smoke at all, right? And it seems to me that's the discussion we're having now. Should we genetically engineer the children to be able to withstand us smoking at the table when we should have a very different discussion? But there's this logic to it that we keep ending up as applied ethicists talking about should we this and that, when we should take 3 steps back and say, no, we shouldn't smoke, right? And that's very hard to get through, I think. So that's why I use the mic now and the opportunity to say it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm afraid that this is how far we got tonight. The clock is 9 o'clock. I'm so sorry. It was so many interesting topics I would really like to continue on, but this is the reality of fitting a peg into a square hole, I guess. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Have to have something works with people's imagination. They'll remember.
And the technology.
I guess
to show the round square. I don't know.